In August 2025, a landlocked nation that the world once dismissed as too poor, too dependent, and too forgotten, sent shockwaves across the globe. Burkina Faso, under the bold leadership of Captain Ibrahim Traoré, signed a $2.1 billion zero-tariff trade agreement with China. It was more than economics. It was defiance. For 500 years, Africa's resources have fed the West, while her people were left with empty hands. And yet, in one stroke of the pen, the chains of economic colonialism cracked. Only 72 hours earlier, Washington had slapped a crushing 50% tariff on Burkina Faso's shea butter, the nation's lifeline. It was meant as a message: submit or starve. But Traoré answered with his own message, and this time, the empire was not ready. What happens when a small African country dares to look America in the eye and say, "We no longer need your permission"? Stay with us, because this isn't just another story. It is the future our ancestors dreamed of. Subscribe and walk with us for an Africa that will never bow again. On the 15th of August, 2025, in the grand halls of Beijing, two men shook hands, and the world felt the tremor. Captain Ibrahim Traoré of Burkina Faso and President Xi Jinping of China signed an agreement worth $2.1 billion. To many, it was just a trade deal, but to Africa, it was a declaration. A declaration that the rules of 5 centuries no longer applied. The details themselves were staggering: $1 billion in guaranteed trade volume over 5 years, zero tariffs on all Burkinabe exports to China, financing at a mere 2% interest rate, compared to the punishing 8 to 12% usually demanded by the World Bank or the IMF. Technology transfer in advanced manufacturing and resource processing, and an additional $800 million in infrastructure, ports, roads, digital networks, and energy grids. What made this deal explosive was its timing. Just 72 hours before, Washington had moved against Burkina Faso. The United States slapped a crushing 50% tariff on the nation's shea butter exports, the second largest source of income after gold. The message was cruelly clear: obey or collapse. But Traoré's reply came not in words, but in action. Within 3 days, he secured the largest trade lifeline in Burkina Faso's history, and one that bypassed America completely. Dr. Fatou Kabore, Burkina Faso's Minister of International Trade, a Harvard-trained economist who chose to serve her homeland instead of Wall Street, explained it simply. The Americans thought they could starve us into submission by closing their markets. They forgot that China has 1.4 billion consumers who value quality African products. We did not just replace the American market, we upgraded it. That statement reverberated across Africa. For decades, nations on the continent were told they could not survive without Western approval. Aid, loans, and grants were dangled like chains disguised as gifts. But here was a leader, Captain Ibrahim Traoré. Captain Ibrahim, latest news proving that independence was not just a dream but a strategy. The symbolism was powerful. In a single stroke, Traoré transformed Burkina Faso from a target of economic punishment into the spearhead of a continental realignment. The signing ceremony in Beijing was not broadcast as a routine partnership. It was remembered as the day American hegemony cracked. Western intelligence agencies called it the agreement that changed everything. Newspapers in Europe called it reckless. Washington insiders labeled it a threat to global stability. But on the streets of Ouagadougou, it was called something else: freedom. For the first time in Burkina Faso's modern history, its trade relationship was structured beyond the reach of Western sabotage. Payments would be made in Chinese yuan and digital currency, not dollars. Shipping routes would go through Chinese-controlled ports in East Africa. Insurance was to be handled by Chinese state companies. And legal jurisdiction would be settled in international arbitration courts, not in Washington or Paris. Colonel Adou Sanfo, Burkina Faso's trade security coordinator, summed it up bluntly: for the first time in our history, we have a trade relationship that America cannot sabotage. They can impose all the sanctions they want. Our goods will still reach Chinese markets, and Chinese investment will still reach our people. Those words hit like thunder. For 5 centuries, Western powers had made it their mission to control every African transaction, from the cocoa of Ghana to the diamonds of Congo. But in 2025, a landlocked nation with barely 20 million people had found a way around the empire's grip. This was not just economics. It was a battlefield, and for the first time in living memory, Africa had seized the high ground. The ink on the Beijing agreement was barely dry when Washington struck back. Within 24 hours, the United States Treasury announced sanctions on 47 Burkinabe officials and their families. Bank accounts were frozen, visas revoked, property abroad seized. It was not diplomacy, it was economic warfare. Then came the financial noose. American allies in Europe moved swiftly to restrict access to international banking channels. SWIFT payments linked to Burkina Faso were flagged, delayed, or outright blocked. Chinese transfers were intercepted. It was a desperate attempt to strangle the $2.1 billion deal before it could take root. But economics was only the first front. In the corporate towers of New York and London, Western multinationals coordinated boycotts against any company daring to trade with Burkina Faso. Insurance firms canceled coverage on shipments. Shipping giants refused to dock Burkinabe goods. What was presented as risk management was, in truth, a coordinated siege. And when sanctions and blockades were not enough, the pressure turned military. AFRICOM, the United States Africa Command, deployed an additional 3,000 troops to neighboring countries. 12,000 more joined military exercises just 50 kilometers from Burkina Faso's border. Drone flights over Ouagadougou became constant, buzzing in the night skies as a reminder of who still believed they held dominion. Special forces were sighted moving through refugee camps, not delivering aid, but recruiting opposition fighters. The message was unmistakable: comply or be destabilized. Then came the war of words. Within days, a $200 million emergency budget was approved for what was cynically labeled information initiatives. CNN, BBC, Reuters, and countless Western outlets ran coordinated headlines calling the China deal a debt trap. In classrooms from Boston to Oxford, Western universities received new grants to publish research condemning African-Chinese partnerships. Professors delivered lectures warning of neo-colonialism by Beijing. And on social media, artificial intelligence churned out fake grassroots posts, portraying Captain Ibrahim Traoré as a reckless dictator selling Africa to the East. It was a script Africa had seen before. Whenever a nation resisted the empire, whether it was Lumumba in Congo, Sankara in Burkina Faso, or Nkrumah in Ghana, propaganda, sanctions, and military intimidation followed. History was repeating itself, with Captain Ibrahim cast as the latest target. But there was a critical difference. This time, the deal was bulletproof. Payments in yuan and digital currency bypassed the dollar. Insurance through Chinese state firms replaced European coverage. Shipping routes through Chinese-controlled ports in East Africa evaded Western choke points. For every sanction, there was a workaround. For every blockade, there was a new path forward. Colonel Adu Sanfo's words echoed like prophecy. For the first time in our history, we have a trade relationship that America cannot sabotage. The empire had unleashed its arsenal, yet found its weapons blunted. Still, the escalation revealed a darker truth. Washington feared not just the deal itself, but the precedent it set. If Burkina Faso could defy the West and survive, what would stop Mali, Niger, or Chad from doing the same? If a landlocked nation with 20 million people could stare down the empire, what excuse remained for Africa's giants? The panic in Washington was not about shea butter or trade figures. It was about control, and control was slipping. What terrified Washington was not simply the deal itself, but the spark it ignited across the continent. In the weeks that followed August 15, 2025, African capitals buzzed with announcements that signaled a seismic shift in direction. In Bamako, Mali broke with decades of French exploitation of its gold reserves. A $1.8 billion partnership with Chinese firms was unveiled, including plans to process gold locally rather than ship it raw to Europe. For the first time in 60 years, Mali would keep the value of its wealth inside its borders. In Niamey, Niger, long strangled by uranium contracts, favoring European power companies, signed a $2.3 billion deal with Chinese nuclear firms. Instead of exporting raw uranium at basement prices, Niger would finally process the mineral on African soil, adding value, creating jobs, and asserting sovereignty. In Domino, Chad announced negotiations for a $1.2 billion oil refinery with Chinese technology. No longer would crude oil leave Africa only to return as expensive refined fuel. Chad's leaders promised that within 3 years, fuel shortages that plagued their people would end. And in Conakry, Guinea declared a $3.4 billion bauxite processing facility, doubling the value of its aluminum exports overnight. For decades, raw bauxite had been shipped abroad, while Guineans remained in poverty. Now, with Chinese investment, the country was building not just a factory, but a future. The pattern was unmistakable. One after another, African leaders were following what the press began calling the Burkina Faso model: trade sovereignty, technology transfer, zero political conditions. It was as though Captain Ibrahim Traoré had handed his neighbors a blueprint for breaking free. Dr. Rivera Sangui, former executive secretary of the United Nations Economic Commission for Africa, described it as the most significant economic realignment since decolonization. His words resonated. What Traoré has done is prove that African countries do not need to choose between development and sovereignty. China is offering what the West never has: partnership without political control. The statistics confirm the shift. In 2020, China-Africa trade stood at $176 billion. By 2024, it had soared to $292 billion, a 65% increase. Projections for 2025 placed it at $340 billion. By contrast, United States-Africa trade had fallen from $64 billion in 2020 to just $47 billion in 2024. The 2025 forecast? A mere $31 billion, a 27% decline. For the first time in modern history, Africa was trading more with Asia than with Europe and North America combined. The empire's grip was slipping, and the numbers told the story. But beyond numbers, there was the psychology. For generations, African leaders were warned that without Western markets, their economies would collapse, that without World Bank loans, their budgets would crumble, that without foreign assistance, they would drown. Burkina Faso's defiance proved otherwise, and the entire continent was watching. In Accra, young Ghanaians trended hashtags celebrating trade freedom. In Lagos, Nigerian students debated how to replicate the Burkina Faso model. In Johannesburg, civil society groups demanded South Africa follow suit. Social media lit up with one question: if Burkina Faso can do it, why not us? This was the true domino effect, not just deals and contracts, but belief. The belief that Africa's chains were not destiny. So I ask you, my brothers and sisters, if you believe this is what Africa needed all along, say amen in the comments below. Because the truth is undeniable. One trade deal had become a continental movement, and the empire knew it. Behind the billions of dollars, behind the headlines in the boardrooms, there are faces. Real people whose lives have been reshaped by the decision of one leader and the courage of a nation. This is where the revolution becomes flesh and blood. Meet Aminata Sawado, a 34-year-old shea butter processor from Kudugu. 3 years ago, she sold raw shea nuts to European buyers for 200 francs per kilogram. They shipped those nuts to factories in Europe, processed them into butter, and sold the finished product back to Africa for 2,000 francs per kilogram. Aminata worked harder and harder, but remained trapped in poverty, watching foreign corporations profit from her labor. Then came the China deal. A processing facility was built in her village. For the first time, women like Aminata produced the finished butter themselves. No middlemen, no foreign gatekeepers. Today, she sells directly to Chinese cosmetics companies for 1,800 francs per kilogram. We kept the jobs, we kept the profits, and we kept our dignity, she says with quiet pride. Her income rose by 280% in just 18 months. Or consider Ibrahim Traoré, not the president, but a 28-year-old logistics coordinator. For years, his work was chained to European shipping routes. Every container passed through ports controlled by foreign companies. Every contract skimmed by international insurers and bankers. Up to 40% of Burkina Faso's profits disappeared into service fees. But under the New Deal, shipments now travel directly from the port of Tema in Ghana to Shanghai, with Chinese companies handling insurance and logistics at only 12%. We tripled our net income overnight, Ibrahim explains. For the first time, we feel the system works for us, not against us. Then there is Fatou Kore, a 41-year-old agricultural engineer. She recalls how European buyers constantly dismissed African quality, demanding endless certifications, exploiting every excuse to pay less. Today, with Chinese partners, her work is judged fairly, her products paid at full market value, and her expertise respected. They treat us as equals, not as charity cases, she says. That shift is not only economic, it is psychological. It restores pride. The transformation is measurable. Employment in processing facilities rose by 450%. Women's participation in export businesses climbed from 23% to 71%. Village-level investment in education and healthcare increased by 340%, as profits stayed within communities instead of flowing overseas. This is not charity, it is justice. It is what happens when Africa stops begging for permission and starts shaping its own destiny. Statistics can sound abstract, but the truth lives in stories like Aminata's. She no longer dreams of sending her children to Europe for opportunity, she dreams of building their future at home. For generations, migration was seen as escape. Now, for the first time, staying feels like victory. In marketplaces across Ouagadougou, young vendors whisper about the opportunities ahead. In classrooms, children study not only French but Mandarin, preparing to engage with a wider world. In villages once forgotten, electricity hums from solar grids built with Chinese technology. The revolution is not distant. It is in every corner of daily life. And that is why this is more than trade. It is liberation. A human revolution that cannot be measured in tariffs or treaties alone, but in dignity restored. If trade gave Burkina Faso breath, then technology gave it wings. Hidden within the $2.1 billion agreement was a commitment far more revolutionary than market access. Technology transfer on a scale Africa had never seen before. In Ouagadougou, the brand new technology center, built with $180 million in Chinese investment, stands as a monument to this shift. Inside its glass walls are advanced manufacturing labs, three-dimensional printing facilities for agricultural tools, automated packaging lines for export products, and research hubs, where young Burkinabe engineers file patents in their own names not under foreign companies. Digital infrastructure spreads like fire. Fifth-generation mobile networks now cover 78% of the country. Fiber optic cables connect towns once isolated. Data centers power e-commerce and mobile banking, allowing villagers to sell goods directly to buyers abroad. Even rural communities once forgotten can now communicate by satellite. Green energy is no longer a dream. Solar panel assembly plants rise in the Sahel, built with Chinese photovoltaic technology. Wind turbines sprout near villages. Waste-to-energy facilities reduce pollution while powering local grids. Battery production plants prepare for the coming wave of electric vehicles, ensuring Africa does not just consume the future, it builds it. Dr. Rasmanet Ouedraogo, director of the center and a Beijing-trained scientist, put it plainly. Western companies came to Africa to extract resources and export jobs. Chinese partners come to Africa to build capacity and create jobs. They teach us how to manufacture, how to innovate, how to compete globally. That is the difference between exploitation and partnership. The results are undeniable. Burkina Faso's manufacturing output has surged by 340% in just 2 years. Technology patents filed by local inventors have risen from 3 to 47 annually. Engineering graduates increased by 280% as new opportunities opened. Technology exports, once non-existent, now exceed $67 million a year. And perhaps most importantly, Africa's youth see possibility. With 67% of the continent's population under 25, this matters more than any statistic. On social media, videos comparing how China builds versus how America extracts gather tens of millions of views. Hashtags like #TradePivot and #AfricaRising trend across 23 African languages. At universities, enrollment in international business has grown by 450%. Mandarin Chinese has become the fastest-growing foreign language in African schools. Student exchanges to China have jumped from 8,000 in 2020 to 37,000 in 2025. Entrepreneurship programs are booming, as young Africans launch import-export ventures of their own. This is a generational awakening, a psychological shift from dependency to agency, from waiting for aid to building industries, from dreaming of escape to creating homegrown futures. But while Africa celebrates, the empire plots. Western intelligence agencies have already branded Traoré, the most targeted leader in modern African history. Their classified response, Operation Trade Disruption, is designed to break this model before it spreads. Sabotage of supply chains, cyber attacks on Burkinabe financial systems, insurance blacklists on trade routes, currency manipulation through the CFA franc, diplomatic pressure on neighbors to isolate Burkina Faso. And far darker, credible assassination plots against Captain Traoré and his closest advisors. This is the cost of defiance. To lead Africa into a future free from permission is to walk with a target on your back. But Traoré accepts it, for he knows the stakes. This is no longer just about Burkina Faso. It is about whether Africa itself will rise or remain chained for another century. The storm is gathering, and the world is watching. 500 years of exploitation. 65 years of broken promises since independence. And yet, in 2025, a small landlocked nation has shown the world that Africa does not need permission to prosper. Captain Ibrahim Traoré's $2.1 billion trade pivot was not just about goods and numbers. It was about reclaiming dignity, about proving that sovereignty is not theory, it is practice. Burkina Faso, once dismissed as hopeless, now boasts the highest GDP growth in West Africa at 6.8%. Export revenue has risen 340% since 2022. Foreign currency reserves have grown from 400 million to over 2 billion. Youth employment in skilled sectors has jumped 280%. These are not fantasies, they are facts. And the ripple is continental. 15 African nations have already followed Burkina Faso's path, signing major agreements with China. Intra-African trade has increased by 67%, powered by new infrastructure. Manufacturing output across participating countries is up nearly 300%. Technology transfer is no longer a dream. It is signed, sealed, and spreading. The empire calls it reckless. We call it liberation. Because the most significant change is not economic, but psychological. African leaders now know they have alternatives. African people now see that independence works. And that truth is more dangerous to Washington than any weapon. As President Cyril Ramaphosa of South Africa declared, Burkina Faso has shown us that we do not have to choose between development and dignity. We can have both, but only if we are brave enough to break free from old patterns. So I ask you, brothers and sisters across the diaspora, will you stand with this vision? Will you lift your voice for an Africa that refuses to bow? If you believe in this new chapter, let the world see it in the comments. Write it proudly. New Africa. If this fifth story moved something in your chest, do not scroll past. Like, share, speak, subscribe, because they hid our history long enough. Now, together, we will speak our future out loud. Captain Ibrahim, latest news is not just about Burkina Faso. It is about Africa refusing economic slavery. It is about Africa rising, and that is why we will never abandon him. Thank you for being here. We'll see you in the next story, the kind they still do not want you to hear.